Hello and welcome to the Elders Insight, an exciting new podcast series presented by Hepworth & Associates, your source for advocacy, advisory, and planning insights for seniors, pre-seniors, and their caring families. Today's podcast is sponsored by Rotary Dial Media. So let's get started with the show on location today in Toronto.
Hello, well, we are back with another episode of the Elders Insight, and what another great summer day to have a podcast. We continue to thank you all for your positive responses that we've been getting, all the emails, the thumbs up, the likes, the clicks, and many of you have downloaded the podcast, which is great to see. So please continue to stay tuned for more episodes, and tell everyone you know to dial in. I guess the phrase is click in, and remember all the podcasts are on the website at hepworth.ca. So let's get on with today's episode. My name is Gary Hepworth, and I am your host for this podcast, and today we are live from Toronto. And we know that everyone can get out to our seminars and workshops, so that's why we've started the podcast series, so that you can listen in from home, wherever you may be, from Melbourne to Toronto. Today's episode is entitled New Research in Aging, and I'm particularly excited about that because it's an area we don't always hear much about. And that said, but equally exciting though, has been the emergence of a number of academic institutions that have invested resources and attracted a lot of expertise over the past years in the subject of aging. And it's also timely because this week in Toronto, in fact I was there today, is the annual conference of the International Federation on Aging, right here in Toronto. So to talk about this exciting area, who better to be sitting here right in front of me than the Executive Director of the National Institute on Aging, Mr. Michael Nissen. Michael has a master's degree in public policy from the University of Toronto. He was formerly Director of Policy for CARP, which you may know is the formal name of the Canadian Association of Retired Persons. He provided advisory services to the Healthcare of Ontario Pension Plan. He was a senior policy advisor to the Ontario Ministry of Senior Affairs, and in fact was the Chief of Staff to the Minister of Seniors Affairs. So he's had quite the career, and we're delighted for him to be here. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you for having me on Elder Insight.
So Michael, tell us about the NIA. Why was it founded? What's its mandate, and what's the relationship with Ryerson University?
Well, I think the answer to most of your listeners on why it was founded would probably be fairly obvious, and I'm assuming that your audience is concerned about aging issues. They might be aging themselves or have parents and family members who are aging.
That's true.
And that's really the impetus for the National Institute on Aging. It's no secret that about, let's say, 10 years ago, although it would have been obvious even earlier than that, we all sort of woke up to the idea that society is aging. This is happening in Canada, it's happening in the US, and in fact it's happening across much of the Western world, and including countries like Japan, and while it's still in the early days because of their population size, countries like China are worried about demographic changes. So I think society-wide, we all woke up to the idea, and probably around 2010-11, when the first baby boomers started retiring, we heard terms like the gray tsunami, the deluge of the old people, whatever you want to call it, and it was largely disparaging, and people acted as though it came out of nowhere. And I had been talking to a demographer at that time who said all you had to do was look at the population pyramids as far back as the 70s to realize that this was going to happen 20, 30 years later. So I think the reason why is that we have a large aging society. Canada certainly does. For the first time in our history, we have more seniors than we have children under the age of 15. And some of this will present us with challenges. In other areas, there'll be opportunities. I don't think it's doom and gloom, but there is work to be done, and that's where organizations like the National Institute on Aging come into play. It was for that basis that it was started, and originally it was started to be a center of excellence on pensions and retirement security. And that was started by Mitch Fraser, who's our founding board member and pension lawyer at Tories. He teamed up with Dr. Samir Sinha at Mount Sinai Hospital, who is his equivalent in the healthcare field, an absolute star, one of the top geriatricians in the world and certainly in Canada. And between the two of them, they decided that the center would maximize its effect, focusing on all issues of aging. Where I come into play and really to fulfill the initial mandate was to make the NIA a policy, a public policy and government-based solutions organizations on aging. There are a number of excellent organizations, think tanks, university research centers that focus on aspects of aging. But I'm proud to say that the NIA is Canada's first and only think tank dedicated, one, exclusively to aging, and two, it dedicated exclusively to focusing on moving public policy in promotion of aging well, aging with financial security, and aging successfully most generally. The connection with Ryerson University is a no-brainer for me. Apart from the fact that it's hard to start anything from scratch, the university provides us with an incredible amount of support, from office space, support financially so that we could get off the ground. And I think most importantly, what it provides us with is access to some of the top scholars, minds, and of course the independent and evidence-based spirit that comes with any good university.
Wasn't there an announcement this week about Ryerson and aging specifically?
Yes, actually, I've been on the job for 6 months, but I thought with the rare opportunity of being an aging center based at a university, the university as a whole could do a lot to show what it's doing for aging. So as the National Institute on Aging embedded in the university, we worked with the President's office and submitted an application to join a global network of age-friendly universities. These are universities who all subscribe to principles. There are 10 of them. Of course, I can't remember all of them off the top of my head. But essentially, the idea is to build universities that are accessible not only physically, but also in terms of curriculum and the spirit of the community, accessible to people of all ages. And Ryerson has been doing an excellent job at this for years. Our entry into the global network is really about broadcasting to our community at Ryerson and also in Canada and globally that we are committed to staying on the path of making the university welcome to people of all ages and abilities. I think a good example of that is the Chang School, the 50 Plus program, where they offer programming for older individuals, and of course the Life Institute. There is a group of about 2,000 older people, former executives, professionals who want to come together, learn, take opportunities to keep up on the latest information. They hold lectures and sessions, and that's just one example of a lot of the things that the Ryerson is doing to support aging. And I think the support it's provided for the National Institute on Aging is further evidence that the university is marching in exactly the right direction.
Age-friendly university, because the average person out there doesn't associate universities with the other side of the spectrum, so it's great to hear. So in terms of research in aging, what are the priorities today in terms of the research going on?
I take that as a slightly trick question.
All right, wasn't meant to be.
Well, only because, in point of fact, I've been thinking about this. So when we were working on the senior strategy that was released last fall by the previous government, the idea that we got a lot from in consulting with seniors and other groups was that you can't talk about seniors as a block. Aging is not a homogeny, and I'd say that's true in the issues that we or any other organization work on. I'd say the biggest priority, and this is a trick answer, is that we need to help Canadians age as successfully as possible. For some people, that'll be health related. For others, that'll be financially related. In other cases, it might be both and a number of other things. Social isolation is a growing concern for a lot of people. Whether you have money or not, you need connections to your community, and that becomes harder with mobility challenges, with lack of transit options, especially in bigger cities and in rural areas if you're isolated. So I think if we want to specify in certain areas, I would say on the financial side, one of our big issues right now is how to manage longevity risk in retirement. So you have two challenges. The first would be getting enough money in the first place so that you could retire securely. That's a major challenge, and unfortunately for a lot of older people, there's a point in time at which it's too late to accumulate more money, right? So that message really needs to be pitched to younger generations. I read a report that the average Canadian doesn't expect to start saving for retirement until 36. It's late, and I understand for a lot of people that's a financial necessity. quickly. I mean, kids are graduating school later, they're staying home with parents later, housing is expensive. It's hard to put together enough money early to save for retirement. But for the older population, managing your resources in retirement is a growing issue. It always has been, but I think the research community in the financial sector is starting to understand this. However much money you have, you need to make it last for a long time, and we're living longer than ever before. So I'd say that's one big challenge. And on the health side, of course, we could talk for hours about various issues, but I would say access to good medical care, and also primarily supports for helping people age in place to maintain their family systems and supports, their familiar surroundings. These are challenges that governments have addressed, and they're doing a good job knocking on the door, but we still haven't found the solution that will really help people age in place.
One of the themes, which I'll come back to, of this conference this week is combating ageism. One of the isms that still is tolerated in society. Is the NIA doing any research around that area at all?
We absolutely will, but I think more important than writing a paper or convening people is really infusing that ethic in everything that we do. Not to play the victim card here, of course, but I realized how pernicious ageism could be when it was about 4 or 5 years ago. I had an interview with an undisclosed company, and it was over the phone, just talking about potential projects. And the person on the phone asked me how old I am. And they were expecting perhaps someone who was 25, but their answer, and it pertained not at all to the job or the conversation, but they said, "Oh, you're not that old yet." And so it made me wonder, at 34, right, if you can get that answer, at what age is someone too old? Is it 40, is it 50, or is it never? I'd like to think it's never. It's based on people's capabilities, their desires, what's available to them. But I think there's also an onus on society to allow people to fulfill what they're able to do, whether it's work or leisure or just travel and mobility.
That's a great point. So have there been any breakthrough discoveries or learnings in the area of aging you'd like to help our listeners understand better?
I think going back to some of our priority work, we released a paper earlier this year on the importance of herd immunity when it comes to certain conditions, and certainly the flu. So if I have the numbers correct at the top of my mind, there were something like 12,000 hospitalizations due to the flu last year.
Wow.
And this is at a time when a number of provinces offer free flu vaccines. We're not there entirely across the board yet, but it's not onerous, it's not hard to get, but for some reason people still aren't taking the flu vaccine, and it's easy to dismiss as a small problem. I could have mentioned something about dementia, but I think we're all aware of how big a problem that is, that sometimes we forget the small things that could hospitalize people. We had a conference in May where we had a panel on flu vaccination, and we had a family patient representative whose father got the flu. Long story short, spent 6 months in and out of hospital recovering, and was really never the same after that. So something as small as that could be a big issue. And in our paper, what we found is that the Canadian government recommends a vaccine rate of 80% or greater to achieve herd immunity. We're in the 60s as a nation. And this is at a time, again, where public service announcements, governments are supporting it, but for some reason we need to do more to get people vaccinated. I bring that up because, again, it's a smaller issue that we're less likely to focus on than we are dementia and radical poverty, which I think are important issues that we're working on, but we can't forget the small ones. And going back to my initial point on the financial side of things, it's really, the technical term that pension experts use is decumulation. If you're going to live 20, 30, 40 years in retirement, how do you manage that responsibly? It's not an easy thing to do for experts or for lay people alike. And so what ends up happening is people tend to be very conservative with their money in the early stages of their retirement, when perhaps in retrospect they might have realized that they could have enjoyed life a little more, spent a little bit more money, and planned for the retirement. But of course it's a double-edged sword, because after about age 85, out-of-pocket expenses start accumulating. And even in a country like Canada, where we have universal healthcare system, there are a number of out-of-pocket expenses that add up, whether it's medical devices, products for assisting in aging, of course, home care. is provided by most governments, but typically people don't get more than 2 to 4 hours a week. So if you need that, you have to go into your pocket. Patients with dementia, I should say people with dementia, often their caregivers are put in a terrible position to have to spend money. So I think the other thing that we're really trying to lay our eyes on going to the future is what the connections are between finances and personal well-being and health. I think we all know that not having money sets you up for a lot of trouble, but what we haven't really figured out is how to formalize that connection and get finance departments and health departments within government to talk to each other as they structure programs. We could pipe dream on health and we could spend a lot of money, but until we really sort of fuse those two in helping people realize, one, how to spend their own money most effectively in retirement, but also two, how governments can more efficiently spend money to tackle problems in healthcare, we'll continue to sort of tread water.
Okay. So the message there is, one is get your flu shot. So one, you mentioned the financial side, which many of our clients we hear all the time is that because we're living longer, and that's just adding to your point, which is people are afraid they're going to outlive their money, right? The old days of retiring at 65, maybe you need retirement for 20 years. Well, now you're living into your 90s and 100 plus. Financial planning is even more important. So twist question here, is there anything in the realm of aging or research that kind of keeps you up awake at night, bothers you about we're not tackling or...
Yeah, I think for me it's largely the financial side. Our healthcare system obviously has a lot of room for improvement. That's where the NIA is going to work to advise governments, strategically help them realize where the evidence points in terms of efficiencies and best results for the dollars they spend on care, but also the best outcomes for patients. But I think there's a lot of attention paid in healthcare that we don't have collectively on the financial side of things. And I recently was having a conversation with some of my friends who are roughly my age, and not to get too personal, but I'm in my mid-30s. And when we're combining longevity with financial issues, I brought up the point that depending on how long some of our parents who are baby boomers might live, there's every bit of a chance that we'll have 3 generations of Canadians currently alive in retirement at the same time in the near future. That would be the baby boomers, of course, Gen X, which is between the baby boomers and the millennials, and the upper end of the millennials, a group of which I'm a part. And so on the personal side, of course, saving is a challenge, but what does a government and a society do when you have a mass amount of people who are retired or not working in older age, haven't saved adequately, and yet the expenses continue to pile up, whether they're medical, whether they're home related, or whether they're just the necessities of life. I think that's something that should keep all of us up, because I think the will and the evidence and money could accomplish a lot, but if individuals don't have the finances in retirement, everything becomes radically difficult.
So you mentioned part of the role of the NIA is to advise government. So is that what you see Keen's trying to advise government how to address that very issue you just spoke about in terms of financial planning?
Yeah, and I think this goes back to the issue of us being housed at Ryerson. We're an independent, unaligned group that follows the evidence. Our job is to take an issue, follow the data and the evidence, see where it leads, and let governments know in a positive way what they could do to better spend their resources and to better help Canadians as they age. So to that extent, I'd say that's exactly what we should be doing. And then more colloquially, I'd say if we're not helping governments implement change, if we're not helping Canadians adapt to an aging society, then there's not much reason to be around. Our driving force, really our mandate, and the way we're going to measure our success going forward. And of course, we're only a 2-year organization, so we have a lot of room to grow. But our measure of success will be, have we affected change in government policy? And also in the private sector, we released a paper this year on working caregivers, and we did a scan of all the existing literature. And while there are some groups talking about caregiving at the employer level, that was a gap that we thought really needed to be filled. We tell governments that we need caregiver tax credits, work leave for caregivers, and that's all great, and governments are starting to move, and of course the federal government does have a tax credit for caregivers. But the lost productivity to employers from caregivers is going to be huge. And I think the particular challenge, another demographic reality, of course, is that women are graduating now. They're predominant graduates of universities. They're filling the ranks of law schools and med schools. They're really swelling the ranks of the professions. And yet, at the same time, that age group, right in the meat of career building between the ages of 35 and 44, are saddled with heavy caregiving duty. And I use heavy in a semi-technical sense, right? Men and women, if you look at the data, roughly equal in terms of the spread of caregivers, but women tend to provide many more hours of caregiving per week than men do. And these are women who are not only starting their careers, at the same time building it, in every hour at work, every ability to network and build your career is important, but they're also starting families. And so what we're telling employers to do is really, one, start with the culture change. Recognize that this is an issue, that your employees are probably doing this, and they're probably doing it in secrecy, right? It's not an issue we talk about. There's not a lot of leeway for them to raise their hand and say, look, it's an emergency, can I go take my mother to the hospital? And so we're starting with culture change, and then also talking about interventions in the workforce that might help caregivers. And this, again, this is, I think, a good example of how we want to intersect financial issues, economic issues with health issues. If you can't be at work and you can't make money, that's going to degrade your economic well-being. Your economic well-being being jeopardized means poor health in the long run, and of course raising a family, working and providing care for an elder takes a heavy toll on people's mental health, which isn't good for them as individuals, of course, but it's also not good for the workforce and for employers.
So how does the average person, how does our listener learn more about the NIA and all the great things you're doing?
Well, I mean, in the parlance of the day, come to our website. It's the NIA at ryerson.ca, and we have a sign-up page where you can get all of our information. We've released 2 papers this year. We have several more in the pipeline, but besides our big research reports, we provide commentary on government action, updates on where improvements are being made across the country, and general analysis of some of the issues that your listeners might care about, like breakthroughs in research or advancements in other fields.
You had a conference before. Are you planning any future conferences? Anything scheduled for this year?
No, well, we had 2 this year.
So we're talking next year? Or?
Yeah, we're talking next year, and it's in the works, so I won't spill the beans on this podcast.
Won't push you.
But we'll come back to you and let you know when the details are finalized, and then hopefully you could share that. But yeah, I mean, our goal is to bridge the divide. We had an event in February that was targeted towards Bay Street, really on the financial aspects of our work, and then in May we had a more community-based conference that was open to anyone and everyone, where we brought experts from around Canada and North America to talk about some of the breakthroughs and leading edges of research.
Michael, this has been great. Really appreciate the insights, input. I think it's a great organization. I'm sure our listeners really benefited from learning about the NIA, and you've now been told how to find out about them. So this institution is going to help us address the challenges of aging and hopefully get governments to fix some of the challenges. So peace of mind is very important, and looks like it's an organization that's maybe going to help us finally achieve that. So Michael, again, thank you for coming in.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, folks, that's a wrap for today's podcast. Thank you all for checking in. So you can click in. Again, if you miss it online, you can go to the website and download it at a later date. And again, if you want to learn more about the National Institute on Aging, or the NIA, it's ryerson.ca/NIA. Got that right, Michael?
Yes.
All right, super. Again, thank you, and thank you all for listening today.
Thanks for joining us today on The Elders Insight. We hope you found this podcast helpful, informative, interesting, and most of all, fun. We hope you can join us for our future podcasts as we continue to be your source for advocacy, advisory, and planning insights for seniors, pre-seniors, and their caring families. A big thanks to Hepworth & Associates team, and we look forward to seeing you the very next time here on The Elders Insight.